And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Paul Martens to lead us through the presentation of the future of TADAT framework. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amina, for that introduction. Good afternoon to everyone here. It's my privilege to be here today at the invitation of the TADAT Secretariat to give you some insights into the future of the Field Guide 2025 as I refer to it. But it would be remiss of me not to do a little bit of a presentation on, or give you a bit of history to do with TADAT. In fact, I can remember walking into this organisation back in 2012, my first day at the IMF, and I think one of my initial meetings, one of the things that I was asked to be involved with was the development of an assessment tool for tax administrations, and that set the scene for the next couple of years, amongst other things keeping me very busy. So at some point, I think it was around in 2014, as we've already mentioned today, I had the privilege of leading some of the initial TADAT pilot assessments. Zambia, as we've talked about today, Norway, and also South Africa were three that come to mind. And that was a proving of this concept of TADAT, the refinement of the product, particularly around good practices and the scoring methodology that we were looking at. A lot has passed since then, and it was interesting when I walked in at the front door today, I saw the current Field Guide, the 2019 version of the Field Guide. I had to go one better and bring the original Field Guide today as well, the yellow version. And then when I was going through and finding that, would you believe I came across the TADAT Framework Pocket Reference Guide. Now, for those of you that have got a big pocket, this may fit. I don't know why I kept that, but it's a collector's item, I'm sure. So I might donate that to the TADAT Secretariat when I leave. Talking about reviews, and that's the point of the subject today. The first review, which again I was privileged to do a lot of things in the IMF, but one of the areas in 2014 that we started to do with the new Field Guide in 2015. The first review we started to look at after about 3 or 4 years, because there were some issues, not issues, but improvements that could be made in the original Field Guide. And that started in around 2018, where we looked at what we could improve, and then resulted in the second and the current version of the Field Guide being released in April 2019, as you would have seen. What were the changes? What were some of the things that we looked at in that? Well, there were the changes to the core taxes and the definition, and this was principally to bring into the framework around core taxes, domestic excise, where it met the principles of what a core tax should be. So that was a specific addition to in that particular Field Guide. There was also the revamp of a couple of the performance outcome areas. Now, particularly POA 2 and POA 6. I referenced POA 2 because it was all about effective risk management. And this is where we saw institutional risk. We still have a big focus on compliance risk, but we saw institutional risk be split between what we call operational risk and operational risk and human capital risk. And there was a big focus on human capital risk, a new indicator and dimension that was assigned to that particular area. The extension of POA 6 around accurate reporting and declarations had 2 new dimensions that were created and input into the Field Guide. One looking at the Audit Quality Assurance Program, and the other looking at the effectiveness of the audit program itself, and they were quite important. Now, along with that, there were a number of enhancements to things like the glossary of terms, But there was also other areas of the field guide that were improved. To give you some, I suppose, emphasis on the size of what was changed, Field Guide 2015, the original one, had 27 indicators and 47 measured dimensions. Field Guide 2019, we saw that increase to 32 indicators and 55 dimensions. And for those of you looking at the size of this document, we went from around 130 pages to 190 pages. So it was a significant volume increase in the actual field guide itself. And I think we also mentioned today, later that year, I think in around November, well, I know in November 2019, the sub-national field guide was released and published. So that leads us to the current review and what we're here to talk about today. So I'll just make sure my papers don't fall everywhere. So on the basis of TADAT's good performance over the first 10 years, and we've heard a lot about that today, and so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, but from going forward, we see no need to make significant changes to the structure or the methodology of the tool itself, and that's an important point. But given the changing landscape in which tax administrations now work, we need to ensure that the tool remains relevant. So some points to note. TADAT will remain an evaluation tool, so we will not be intending to extend the scope of the tool to incorporate greater detail on the development of reform plans. Those of you that understand the different phases of TADAT, phase 4, the final phase of the process itself, talks about post-assessment dialogue, okay? And that's basically what happens after the assessment is finalised. So it will remain an evaluation tool. The POA structure will remain in place. The 9 POAs that we all know, we all are very fond of, will remain in place. But there is expected to be new dimensions and some new indicators based on both an update of good practices, which still remain the foundation of the tool, and catering for changes in the tax administration environment that I've just alluded to before. So in undertaking this review, we appreciated very early on that TADAT must take into account at least 3 things that impact on tax administrations today. The first one is technological advances. So the use of technology itself, along with enhancements in such things as data collection and analytics. The second area we need to take account of is economic globalisation, particularly in the area of international taxation. And the third area is the changing societal values. And here I'm talking about key focus areas of gender and climate change. So these 3 things are clear in our mind when we go forward in reviewing the field guide. In doing this, however, we must be particularly cognizant, particularly in the area of technological advances, of the different levels of tax administration capacity when it comes to determining recognised international good practice. This still means that we'll identify it, absolutely, but we'll need to appreciate, particularly in our performance measurement framework, that advanced administrations will have a much higher level of technical capability. So our methodology. Let's look at the review and how we've consulted so far. As you know, I'm sure you do know, and those of you that don't, there was an external review undertaken last year on TADAT, and those findings will be included in this current review of the field guide. But since then, we've undertaken what we consider to be a very broad and most inclusive consultative approach as possible. This commenced late last year, where we went out to a number of high users of TADAT, okay, both individuals and groups, and sought some responses from them. And we received 15 quite detailed responses. Since then, a wider range of stakeholders, including the broader international community, has been encouraged to provide feedback. Much of this was done during the regional workshops that have been mentioned already today, and they were undertaken back from February until quite recently. And they were using a prepared questionnaire. Now, those of you that might have seen this questionnaire would have noted how structured that questionnaire was. The reason for that, it was a lesson learned from the 2018 review that we had to have a structured questionnaire to make sure people understood what we were trying to achieve by this revision. We're still receptive to further feedback, but as our timeline towards the end of this presentation will show, that time is fast running out. Most interesting now, what types of feedback have we received so far? Suggestions have ranged, of course, from how the tool should be used to the content, the specific content covering all chapters of the field guide and the related appendices. What are the most common feedback areas? Well, there are three. We've had a range of suggestions around good practice changes, the performance measurement framework, and changes to the dimensions and indicator structure. So for good practices, these evolve. We understand that what was good in 2018, 2019 has now been either surpassed or removed completely. So we have to keep pace with these good practice changes that form the basis or the foundation of the tool. We've talked about the performance measurement framework, the scoring, the ABCD scoring. Now, 55 dimensions, 45 feedback respondents there are 45 dimensions have been identified in our feedback that require some amendment. And as I said before, we received some very detailed submissions in the feedback, so quite extensive amount of feedback in that particular area. And changes to dimensions and indicators. Things like, for example, should we still use telephone call waiting times in indicator P39. Also, a new dimension proposed for payment in POA 5 around initiatives used by tax administrations to encourage on-time payments. So those types of things that we need now to consider. And I should have reiterated before, is at the moment we are gathering and considering what is there. We have yet to make decisions. Some other feedback areas, the scoring method. As you know, we've got the two methods, M1 and M2, M1 being the mutual dependency type scoring method, M2 being the average. It's not around the scoring itself, the use of the two methods, but where they're actually used. So there's been some strong suggestions and quite powerful suggestions around whether or not we should move from M1 to M2 for certain indicators. So we'll consider that. The assessor checklist of questions. Dearly loved section of the field guide. In fact, one of the strengths of the field guide, and one of the strengths of the field guide. So we've looked at those types of things, and the pre-assessment questionnaire, which is quite important. Simplification of Table 2, which is the movement in the taxpayer register, and a rework of Table 14, which is around dispute finalisation of things that are clearly in our scope. So apart from that, one of the things that also came up in our feedback was how we deal with small administrations, because often administrations are quite small, have difficulty undertaking the full range of TADAT activities that we need to do. Just moving on now to the actual graph that shows the POA responses by these most common areas. It just gives you a sense of the numbers of feedback that we received for the different areas, whether they be on good practices, whether they be on indicators or dimensions, or whether they relate to the performance measurement framework. So on the basis of the feedback that we've received so far, we've got a lot to do. Okay, good practice changes, as I've mentioned before, to keep the product contemporary in its nature. We are looking at the technology, incorporating how tax administration's digital strategies and IT systems are keeping up with the pace of change and supporting efficient administration of taxes. The use of tax automation, AI, leveraging technology to provide enhanced services, providing direct taxpayer interaction while maintaining data and information security. Basically, this is where we'll be looking to see how tax administration may be adopting terms like GovTech as part of the government's whole approach to public sector management. The extent to which tax administrations are becoming more data-driven, for example, pre-filling declarations, particularly VAT declarations from data generated from e-invoicing, will be something that we're looking at exploiting new sources of data to be used in the compliance risk management approach. And how tax administrations are satisfying wider reporting obligations and addressing international tax risks. Looking also at whether tax administrations collect gender-specific data, how a tax administration's business processes and its human resource strategies are geared towards treating all taxpayers fairly, irrespective of gender, and how the administration's HR strategies facilitate reconciliation of private and professional life and the promotion of women to positions of responsibility. And lastly, we're looking at how tax administrations are rising to the climate change challenge, both organisationally and operationally, through policies on reducing organisations' gas emissions and energy consumption, things like carrying out carbon audits and responsible purchasing policies. So, a lot of work to do, particularly around the indicator and dimension split, and we expect some change to that. A retweak of the assessor checklist of questions. The performance management framework is something that we're also looking at doing in quite some detail, but it's something that we need to make sure our good practices, our indicator dimension structure is set before we then move into the actual scoring mechanism itself. We've had suggestions on the performance assessment report itself. There was, particularly now, with repeat assessments, how that can be improved to capture better findings from the previous assessments and what has happened in the current assessment. Certainly, my takeaway from today is how we reinforce that message about publication of the performance assessment report, how we actually do that. And what springs to mind immediately, it comes up 3 times. It comes up when the initiation phase, when we first talk to the administration or the sponsors of the actual assessments itself. It comes up at the exit interview where we're presenting the findings of the performance assessment report, and then it comes up again at the end of the quality assurance process for the report when the final report is released. And of course, there has been some suggestions on how the field guide should better provide a platform for more effective collaboration between development partners and countries that seek their support through and beyond the TADAT process. And any change here needs to be very much aligned with the fact that TADAT will remain an evaluation tool itself. Our timeline, just briefly, as you can see, it's quite tight. We're here already in June 2024, and by the end of next month, we're looking to produce a preliminary draft of Field Guide 2025. That then will go through further analysis and refinement, and then a formal approval process for publishing of the Field Guide in the first quarter of 2025. And just to briefly recap, we're focusing on ensuring that TADAT itself remains that contemporary product and the preferred diagnostic assessment tool for tax administrations, and we're confident to do that. We will continue our partner engagement. We see that as critical to good outcomes for the product itself. Involvement of the Technical Advisory Group and the TADAT Steering Committee is imperative as suggested changes are identified. And lastly, the TADAT community will need to be informed of what we're doing, and they have been already through our process and seeking feedback. But when the field guide is finalised, then the continuation of the training and familiarisation with the new field guide. So that is something that will continue as well. So I think that's about it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand you back to you.